Hello everyone, this is Philosophy 74, week 9, and we are doing Spinoza today. So this is the beginning of part 3, the third and final part of the class. Remember that we started this semester in the face-to-face situation, right? The first part was called Ethics and the Law, right? The distinction, the conflict very often between ethics and the law. And in that section, that part of the class, 4 weeks, the first 4 weeks, right, we started, well, first of all, with a general introduction to philosophy and ethics, the question of the just and unjust law. And so we moved into the second week into Plato, Socrates and Plato, right? And we saw two dialogues. Actually, you see from one dialogue by Plato, and then the Apology, which is Socrates' defense at his trial, and then we moved to the week 3, Antigone by Sophocles, right, the Greek tragedy, and Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail, and then Immanuel Kant on the metaphysics of morals. But that was the general question. The main theme was always this distinction between ethics and the law, or the moral law and that's redundant, but let's say legal law. And this is a theme that will continue in any case throughout the semester, okay? So, but part 2 of the class that began right week 5 was called Happiness, Excellence, Dependency, and Care. In that section of the class, we saw 3 books by from the Ethics of Aristotle, and then we also saw Epictetus, right, the manual, right? Remember the manual that begins at the outset with the idea some things are in our power, other things are not in our power. So, but the question was that of, the good life. What is it to have access to the good life? And then we saw the question of dependency and care. Care already introduced in the section on the week that we did Epictetus, but then we read this, remember, essay by Eva Kitei on the question, of dependency. And also, there was a chapter from my book, from Earthly Plenitudes, but the question of dependency. So the idea that we are all ultimately interdependent, and that dependency is, as Kitei says, an inescapable, right? The inescapable fact, inescapable fact of the human condition. Okay. So that was, remember, I don't want to be too long as always, and sorry for the delay in making and then posting the video, but do in any case the discussion board entry weekly, right? That's all we are doing this semester in terms of assignments. So today we begin this third and final part of the class, which I call the title for these 4 weeks. The title is The Ethics of Civility. Then I will talk more about civility in week 12, the last week, right? But that's the title for the part of the class. Still, the question of the distinction between ethics and the law should be kept in mind, and also the question of the good life, happiness as the good life, the question of care, and the question of dependency as well. Okay, so but today, the class for today, for this week actually, May 7th, starting yesterday actually, or 2 days ago actually, Thursday, May 7th, and ending May 12th, right? The title for the heading for this week is Emotions, Bondage and Freedom. Okay, we are reading Spinoza, 2 short sections, right, from his Ethics, and we are reading the appendix to part 1, at the end of part 1, a few pages, and also a few pages at the beginning of part 4 of the ethics on the strengths of the emotions. We just read a few pages from the preface, okay? And also maybe I'll touch on, as we go from part 1 to part 4, I will say something about the opening, the outset of part 3 of the ethics, okay? So I mean there would be so much to say about Spinoza, but we can't get into the only thing that I want to say is that as you open the ethics, right, which is a very difficult book, I mean you see that part 1 is called first of all, right, the title for part 1 is concerning God, right? God, okay, this idea, I just want to say this, that's the general framework, if you will keep this in mind. For Spinoza, God is nature, nature is God, okay? There is no difference between God and nature. So this means that for Spinoza, right, this very important philosopher, for Spinoza, basically, ultimately, there is this immanent rather than transcendent model paradigm. Transcendent is, all the tradition in which you have in philosophy, in religion, the idea of the supernatural, right? I mean, a higher level of, reality, God, a higher being, and so on and so forth. That's God, who is the creator, okay? That's the paradigm of creationism. Then you have transcendence, something that goes, over and beyond the order of creation, the world in which we are. But for Spinoza, and he's not the only one, but certainly for him, there is, instead of transcendence, there is immanence, okay? I-M-M-A, not I, A-N-C-E, N-C-E, okay? Immanence, okay? Where the idea is ultimately the opposite. I mean, we can say that for Spinoza, and according to the model of immanence, everything stays within. There is no outside. Of course, if there is no outside, there is no inside. But just to explain this somehow, let's say that everything remains within. So to speak, God is always there. That's a simplification, maybe simplistic, but God is nature, nature is God. Everything is natural, there is no supernatural, okay? As we will see, also, the emotions, because I want to stress this, very important moment in Spinoza concept of the emotions are also, of course, natural phenomena, okay? So in any case, because again, we can't, and then next time we do Nietzsche, week 10, and then we move on, okay? So to Benjamin, and then Balibar, okay? But let me actually go directly to the appendix to part 1 of the ethics. For you, it's on page 238, right at the bottom of page 238, where you had this appendix. So I told you some important moments in important concepts in Spinoza's philosophy. Keep that in mind, okay? God is nature, nature is God, and probably we will see this later in part 4, but again, we can't read everything together. So in the appendix to part 1 is precisely about, then I will get more into the question of the emotions and bondage and freedom, but it is about the question of prejudice, the question of the many types of misconception that we have about things that arise precisely from our inability to see things the way they are and to make up, imaginary, situations. And so that's, he says, I can now explain the nature and properties of God, that he necessarily exists, that he is one alone, but remember, God is nature, same idea, okay? That he is and acts solely from the necessity of his nature. So basically the idea that we are going to see, that I want to focus on, is that, Spinoza says there is a basic difference between the way in which God or nature acts according to the necessity precisely of its nature and the way we do things. We do things usually, right, the human level, we do things usually with an end in view, right? But God or nature has no end in view. Things don't happen. Think about what people usually say. Things happen for a reason. This is a very problematic idea. What do we mean when we say that? I mean, it's if this reason, pay attention to this. This is very important, right? Because there is some confusion in relation to what we mean by reason, right? If we mean a final reason, right, that for the sake of which we do something, then this does not happen when we are speaking about God or nature. I mean, it's not there, I mean, we do things for, a reason, a final reason, right? But, the natural phenomena, like even including, as Spinoza will mention as well, natural disasters, they don't happen, for a reason in that sense, right? I mean, there is no end in view, right? The reason, rather the cause is not the final cause, okay, the final reason, final cause, but it is an efficient, this word may be, think about the meaning of efficient cause, is what produces the conditions for something, right? I mean, if there is a storm, there must be conditions whereby the storm is brought about. But it's not the case that the storm comes to punish people or, whatever other situation that at times, other justification, right, that we hear at times, right? So then Spinoza says on page 239, this is in the appendix, now all the prejudices which I intend to mention here turn on this one point: the widespread belief among men that all things in nature, and remember, nature is God, God is nature, are like themselves in acting with an end in view. That's what I was saying before. We do act with an end in view, but nature or God does not. Okay? Indeed, they hold it as certain that God himself directs everything to a fixed end, for they say that God has made everything for man's sake and has made man so that he should worship God. So this is the first point I shall consider. I'm reading. I will do a lot of reading today. Seeking the reason why most people are victims of this prejudice. It is a prejudice and people are victims, okay? And why all are so naturally disposed to accept it, right? And then he continues, he says, secondly, I shall demonstrate its falsity, and lastly, I shall show how it has been the source of misconceptions about good and bad, right and wrong, praise and blame, order and confusion, beauty and ugliness, and so on. Perfection and imperfection. We will see this at the outset precisely of part 4. Then we'll speak about that in a moment. The preface to part 4. All these concepts, these values, are ultimately relative. Okay, starting from whenever we say that something is perfect or imperfect, it is always relative to the intention of whoever made the thing, right? But in nature, right, nothing can be said to be defective, nothing can be imperfect, and thus not even it's not a question of perfection, imperfection, it's beyond that, neither perfect nor imperfect, or in any case everything is okay, everything is perfect the way it is. As Spinoza says in part 4, we will see perfection and reality are the same. Right? What is real is also perfect. Right? So there is no imperfection in nature. Imperfection, perfection, these are things that we, labels that we put on things, categories, values, right? Good and bad, right? Beautiful and ugly, and so on and so forth, okay? So in any case, then we'll go to that in a moment. That's especially then developed in part 4. But another important point here in the appendix to part 1, again, I'm back to page 239, read a list, pay attention to the highlighted sections when Spinoza says that's in the second paragraph. From this it follows, firstly, that men believe that they are free. This is very important, right? I mean, Spinoza, then Nietzsche, next week we'll see the same. We very often believe that we are free, and there is a reason for that. So we are much less free than we think we are, and there is a reason for that, because very often Spinoza says we are aware of our desire, we know what we want, but we don't know why we desire that, why we want it. We are ignorant. We are unaware of the causes of what causes our desire, okay? I mean, I know I want X, but I don't know why, right? So I may be conditioned by whatever, in my past, my background, whatever. I may be determined, and I don't know what this determination, what the causes of my desire are. And actually this is what he says right here, right? I continue the reading, precisely because, right? I mean, men believe that they are free precisely because they are conscious of their volitions, right? I mean, things that we want, right? The word relates to, volunteering, and so on, relates to the question of the will, what we want, right? Their volitions and desires, yet concerning the causes that had determined them to desire and will, they do not think, not even dream about, because they are ignorant of them, okay? And then he continues, secondly, I'm still reading, men act always with an end in view, right? I mean, we always try to get some advantage, by and large, by what we do, right? An end in view, that is to say, the advantage, precisely, Spinoza says, that they seek, right? Hence, it happens that they are always looking only for the final causes of things done, and are satisfied when they find them. Now, the final cause is one thing, but we confuse this and very often the efficient cause. Remember, what creates the conditions for the possibility of something, okay? So, in any case, then you read the rest again, read everything, especially pay attention to, again, the highlighted sections, and then he says at the end of page 239 that very often we go from these misconceptions, right? Thus it was that this misconception developed into superstition, right, and became deep-rooted in the minds of men, and so on and so forth, right, because, as we try to explain the final causes of everything. And there is soon a wonderful example, illustration, famous, that I will read in a moment, okay? But again, and this is, when on page 240, Spinoza says, consider, I pray, what has been the upshot. Among so many nature's blessings, they were bound, bound to discover quite a number of disasters, such as storms, earthquakes, diseases, and so forth. And they maintain that this occurred because the gods were angry at the wrongs done to them by men, or the faults committed in the course of their worship. And this is something which, Spinoza is 17th century philosopher, but this is something that we still hear often today. People, speaking of natural disasters in those terms. I mean, God is upset because of people's, lifestyles, sexual life, and so on and so forth, right? I mean, there are people who still say this. And Spinoza's attack against this form of thinking, right? His critique of this way of thinking based on misconception, prejudice, superstition is still very important even today. And Spinoza says, and although daily experience cried out against this, and showed by any number of examples that blessings and disasters befall the godly and the ungodly alike without discrimination. They did not on that account abandon their ingrained prejudice. Okay, like I said, this is still going on today. And then there is, in the middle of page 240, a very important sentence that I'm reading. I mean, actually, it's where he says, there is no need to spend time in going on to show that, and this is what comes next, is very important, that Spinoza says nature has no fixed goal. Again, no end in view, no fixed goal. I mean, things don't happen for a reason. Things don't happen because they're meant, they're supposed to happen that way, okay? And that all final causes are but figments of the human imagination. Okay, this is very important. Figments of the human imagination. And then he's, speaking more about this, and I go now to this wonderful example, okay, that you can read. I just maybe sum up the wonderful illustration where he says, this is page 241, right? I mean, I must not fail to mention, right, then go to the highlighted section, that a new style of argument is made to prove their doctrine, and there is a reduction not to the impossible but to ignorance, right? And for example, that's the example, the illustration, wonderful. And so think about this, because I also asked you to, in the discussion board, for the discussion board entry for this week, to write on precisely this some problems arising from the reading of this appendix to part 1 of the Ethics and the preface to part 4, okay? So the idea, he says, if a stone falls from the roof on somebody's head and kills him, by this method of arguing, they will prove that the stone fell in order to kill the man. Okay, so it's not that the man is killed because the stone falls, right? But they say that the reason that the stone fell precisely to kill the man. Okay, this is a very common, widespread way of thinking, which should be corrected, of course, right? And and then Spinoza goes on and he says, if you try to explain that it was a matter of coincidence, perhaps, right? The stone fell because it was windy. The man was walking by down because he had been invited by a friend, and so on and so forth. They will insist and say, well, but why was the wind blowing? Why was the man walking exactly at that moment? Why had he been invited precisely on that, and so on and so forth? He says there is no end to this type of questioning and reasoning, right? And then you will see until right, people then take refuge, he says, in he says the will of God, which is, he calls that the sanctuary of ignorance. All right. So read this is very important, okay? And so they will go on and on asking the causes of causes until you take refuge in the will of God, that is the sanctuary of ignorance, okay? Which is very important. And this is also why, one of the reasons why then Spinoza is considered a dangerous philosopher as well. Okay, so there is no will of God in that sense. There is nothing supernatural, and there is certainly nothing supernatural, right? Organizing human life, right? I mean, so that's there are many ways in which we can look at coincidence in human life. Things happen because they do happen, because there are the conditions for them to happen, but not that they happen for a reason, that they are meant to be that way. So there is also a denial in Spinoza of the question of destiny. There is no destiny in that sense, okay? And no miracle. I mean, he also attacks the idea of miracles, in the next paragraph, and so then he moves into the question of the values, the relative importance of values such as good, bad, order, confusion, and so on, to which he will go back in part 4. And I read maybe this from also because I don't want to be too long. So, but this is basically what you find in the appendix, which is important, right? And he says, for example, on page 242, in the second paragraph, he says at one point, people, right, they are firmly convinced that there is order in things, ignorant as they are of things and of their own nature. Okay, so the arrangement is relative to our imagination. So let me move to actually part 4, and as I do that, I just want to touch on the only a few lines, a couple of lines at the outset of part 3, and then say something about the preface on part 4. Now, part 3 is called Concerning the origin and nature of the emotions, and in the preface, this is page 277. That's not mentioned in the syllabus, but in any case you can find it easily, right? He says, Spinoza says, most of those who have written about the emotions, affectibus, the affects, okay, that's Latin, and human conduct seem to be dealing not with natural phenomena. The important point here is also emotions are, natural phenomena that follow the common laws of nature, but with phenomena outside nature. But there is nothing outside nature for Spinoza, right? So they appear to go so far as to conceive man in nature as a kingdom within a kingdom. This is very important. We will find something similar in Nietzsche. There is here a critique of that we already saw last week with the question of dependency and care with Kite, right? A critique of the independent, right, and sovereign individual. I mean, the kingdom within a kingdom, that meaning, when people say, well, I do as I please, in my life, I decide what to do, I choose freely, I am free, I am independent, and so on and so forth. This is not the case, right? I am the king within, my own apartment, house, life, and so on and so forth, the kingdom within a kingdom. Spinoza says this is untrue. This is false, okay? They believe that he disturbs rather than follows nature's order and has absolute power. A human being, right? Any person, that he or she has absolute power over their actions, and is determined by no other source than himself, herself, and so on, right? So this is again false. That's basically the idea in Spinoza. There is no, sovereignty in that sense, that I do as I please, right? And he continues again, they assign the cause of human weakness and frailty not to the power of nature in general, but to some defects in human nature, and so on and so forth. Okay, so, but let me, this is, you can read more of the highlighted sections in part 3. That was the beginning of the outset of part 3, but I want to move to part 4 briefly because, we don't have much time, but I hope that so far that I made some of these, important moments in Spinoza clear, right? Part 4 is called of human bondage or the strength of the emotions. Now, the emotions are very important. That's what we are ultimately, right? So the question in Spinoza, which is in a sense similar to what we saw already in with Epictetus, the Stoic, right? I mean, the idea that the emotions are so strong that they can destroy us. Remember, in Epictetus we saw the fact precisely he starts right his manual with the idea right that some things are in our power, some things are not in our power, that we had to detach ourselves from the emotions. That was the idea of the ideal of apathy, apatheia, right? To be distant from the emotions in order to be able to manage them, to handle them. Same idea in Spinoza, right? I mean, he begins this important preface to part 4, and then I will say something also about, you can read some sections from part 5 where he goes from bondage to then freedom, liberation and freedom. But he says here, this is page 320, I assign the term bondage, servitude, right, to man's lack of power to control and check the emotions, right? Very often we are not able to do so precisely. Remember, we saw this as well with Epictetus, right? For a man at the mercy of his emotions is not his own master and is subject to fortune, in whose power his soul lies, that he is often compelled, although he sees the better course, to pursue the worse, right? Very often this happens. I mean, I see that, something might not be good for me, but I still do it. Very often we act on the basis of our emotions. Think about one of the most important, maybe powerful emotions, maybe that of fear. How many things we do and very often we then make mistakes ultimately, right? We realize we shouldn't have done some, but we do it on the basis of and because of fear. And all the other emotions, even the so-called what one might think of as good emotions, love for example, can also be right overwhelming, and it can also be destructive and so on and so forth, right? So the question, the important, right, that we saw in Epictetus too is, again, in Spinoza, just like in Epictetus, the question is not to get rid of the emotions, repress the emotions, get rid of them, because we shouldn't, we couldn't, right? That's what we are. Emotional, affective beings, right? But the question is, that we had to learn how to control, if you will, the word is used here by Spinoza, check, these words might be too strong, or simply, handle, manage, right, the emotions the right way, direct the emotions. So instead of trying to get rid of the emotions, right, we had to direct the emotions in a positive rather than negative way. And let me say here, because we are not really seeing this in the text we are reading today, but among the many emotions, the spectrum of emotions, there are two that are most important in Spinoza, joy and sadness, okay? And they are a function of power. Now, let me speak briefly about this word power. Power in Spinoza is important, just like, emotions, desires, and so on. Now, power not understood in the political sense of authority and so on and so forth, right? And we spoke already about this when we did the Kite section, right? But power is a power to do something, the ability, the capacity that we have to do things, potency, energy, and so on and so forth, right? So when our power is increased, right? If there is an increase of our power to do things, to act, then we move closer to joy. If there is a decrease in our power, right, the power to act, to do things, then we move closer to sadness, right? Sadness and joy are, opposite emotions, if you will, extreme, right? And again, they come about because of an increase or a decrease of power, okay? And of course, because everything affects everything, we affect one another, right? And whatever affects, for Spinoza, the body affects the mind, and so on and so forth. Of course, think about that. Even in daily, right, interpersonal relationships, relations can increase our power. Other people and what we do ourselves can increase our power to do things, to act, to be more active. And the more active we are, the closer we move to, the emotion of joy, a situation of joy. Or they can, these relationships, whatever affects us, right, can decrease our power, make us, it can make us sad, depressed, and so on and so forth, less active, and therefore we move closer precisely to sadness, okay? So that's basically, ultimately, the twofold direction that the emotions can take, one toward a situation of servitude and bondage, right, in relation to the emotions, right, and the other direction would be the path to freedom and liberation, right, because freedom is ultimately understanding things, doing things with a clear understanding not simply what I want, what I desire, but also why I want it, why I desire it, and then I become freer, right? I become free when this happens, okay? Otherwise, I am acting very often on the basis of and because I am determined by emotions, and I do things ignorant as I am of why, of the causes of right, my desires, and so on and so forth, okay? So it is important to understand the emotions and to use them and direct them the right way, okay? The right way, this is again relative to us, as we will see in a moment, okay? So in any case, he says, I hope that this was clear, because this is basically what we see in Spinoza, right? That there is this, in a sense, it's the opposite, in a sense, of what we saw at the beginning of this class with Socrates, Plato, and then, the question of the universality of values, ethical values, and so on and so forth, right? So, but that's what he says. He's going to now speak about the question of precisely, perfection, imperfection, good and bad, and so on, right? And he says, this is the second paragraph, he who has undertaken something and has brought it to completion, right? And you have a footnote right there on the page. Completion is the same as perfection, right? Read the footnote as well. Perfect means finished, complete, right? will say that the thing is completed, and not only he but everyone who rightly knew or thought he knew the intention and aim of the author of that work. For example, that's a great example that you can read and use. If anyone sees a work which I assume is not yet finished and knows that the aim of the author is to build a house, he will say that the house is imperfect. On the other hand, as soon as he sees that the work has been brought to the conclusion that its author had intended to give it, he will say that it is perfect. Okay, so let's say that someone, building a house, leaves the house apparently unfinished, right? But that's, for example, an aesthetic touch or whatever. Then it is finished. It is perfect the way it is. Okay, again, these values are relative. Perfect, imperfect, good, bad, and so on and so forth. Okay, and but he continues. If anyone sees a work whose like he had never seen before, and he does not know the author's, the artificer's intention, he cannot possibly know whether the work is perfect or imperfect. Okay, so that's basically the idea. And then he continues and he says that again, perfect, imperfect are ways in which we label things, right? And this is from the last 3 lines, the bottom of page 320. For men are wont to form general ideas both of natural phenomena and of artifacts, right? And these ideas they regard as models, and they believe that nature, which they consider does nothing without an end in view. But remember that this is not the case for Spinoza. Then looks to these ideas and holds them before herself as models. So, and this is very important, and then maybe I start wrapping up there, right? So when they see something occurring in nature at variance with their preconceived ideal of the thing in question, they believe that nature has then failed or blundered and has left the thing imperfect. But again, remember, I said that before, there is nothing really imperfect, nothing defective in nature. And so we see, I continue reading, that men are in the habit of calling natural phenomena perfect or imperfect from their own preconceptions rather than from true knowledge, right? I mean, of course, we say that all the time. This is, like a sunny day, beautiful day. We say perfect day, but all days are perfect. Everything is perfect the way it is. Perfection is reality. Reality is perfection, as he soon says, right? And so, but in any case, I want to wrap up. I hope that I gave you a sense of this, some ideas. Then he goes into the question of good and bad. And let me see if I find exactly where he says, but you will find it around here, right? The idea that, again, first of all, he also goes into the question of the final cause, right? He says, first of all, this is still page 321, like line 8 from the top. So the reason or cause why God or nature. So this is very important, okay? When you read God, comma, or nature, that's where we find, that's one of the places where we find this important moment that I mentioned at the beginning of this class today, the idea that God is nature, nature is God. God or nature, or means whether you say God or you say nature, you're speaking about the same idea, the same reality, okay? And so they're one and the same. Therefore, just as he does not exist for an end, so he does not act for an end. And then he says in the next sentence, what is termed a final cause, we spoke about this already, is nothing but human appetite insofar as it is considered as the starting point or primary cause of something. And then he goes into, read more about this, and he says then in the next paragraph, so perfection, and I close there maybe, sorry, and imperfection are in reality, this is very important, perfection and imperfection, but then also good and bad, right and wrong, beautiful and ugly, are in reality only modes of thinking, right? Like the figment of the imagination that we saw before, modes of thinking, labels that we, categories that we apply to things, ways in which we think about stuff, right? And he says at the end of this sentence, and then I close there, he says what I mentioned earlier, he says that by reality and perfection, I mean the same thing, okay? What is real is perfect, right? Again, there is no defective occurrence in nature, right? That's something that we do, on the basis of our misconceptions, our preconceived ideas and ideals. We say something looks strange, something is strange, weird, right? Something is, and this is, think about the implications of this, very important, right? The question of the norm and whatever is not the norm. Normal, what is normal? And then whatever is not normal, we call abnormal, deviant, and so on and so forth. But this is, again, our problem, so to speak, right? I mean, it's not that something is really normal or abnormal, right? There are, if anything, many norms. Everything is perfect the way it is. That's the important, lesson that you should draw from this, or at least, think about this, say what you think. But the idea, the implications are very important, right? Because it is we ourselves who say, oh, this is good, this is bad, this is perfect, imperfect, normal, abnormal, and so on and so forth. And the implications at times may be also very dangerous, very tragic, very important, certainly in reality, okay? But we should understand precisely that all these categories, all these values, all these ideas are only modes of thinking. That doesn't mean that we should get rid of all of them, right? Just like the emotions, but we should, put this in the right context, perspective, and understand what the nature of things really is, and our own nature as well. Okay, so but I hope this has been longer than I intended it to be, but I hope that I made some very difficult, book, and we are only reading these few pages from Spinoza's Ethics. I hope that I gave you some ideas, insights that I help you somehow in reading this. Do the discussion board entry, contact me if you have questions, and I'll see you next time. We'll do niche. Okay, bye. Thank you.